The night Carla Reyes decided to stop being afraid, she was sitting on a flattened cardboard box in the doorway of a laundromat on Mercer Street, watching the rain turn the gutters into small brown rivers. Her daughter, Lily, was asleep across her lap, 7 years old and blissfully unaware that the sleeping bag wrapped around her was the only dry thing they owned. Carla had $3.42 in the front pocket of her jacket. She knew the exact amount because she had counted it 4 times that afternoon, as if the number might change, as if hoping hard enough could turn coins into something that mattered. She was 31 years old. She had a high school diploma, 2 years of community college, and 15 months of experience working the front desk at a budget motel on Route 9 before the place got sold and the new owners replaced the staff with a kiosk. Before that, she had worked the breakfast shift at a diner, stocked shelves at a pharmacy, cleaned hotel rooms on weekends while Lily was at her grandmother's house. She had never stopped working. Not once. Not for a single week, since Lily was born. And she was still here. Cardboard and rain and $3.42. The laundromat owner, a quiet man named Mr. Prakash, let her stay most nights. He pretended not to see her when he locked up, and she pretended to be surprised each morning when the lock turned and he opened the door without comment. It was an arrangement built entirely on the dignity of not acknowledging what it was. Carla was grateful for it in the way you were grateful for things that should not have to exist. She looked down at Lily's face. The girl slept with her mouth slightly open and her dark hair fanned out against Carla's knee. 7 years old. She liked dinosaurs and the color orange and a particular brand of cheese crackers Carla hadn't been able to buy in 3 weeks. She believed, with the absolute certainty that children carried before the world educated it out of them, that her mother was going to fix everything. Carla pressed her palm gently against her daughter's shoulder and felt the full weight of that belief sitting on her chest like something physical. If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. That was the week the letter arrived. It came to the shelter on Dunmore Avenue, addressed in formal typed font to Carla Maria Reyes, forwarded 3 times by a postal service that had apparently been trying to locate her for 4 months. A woman at the shelter named Donna held it out to her with the careful neutrality of someone who had learned not to guess what mail meant to the people who received it. Could be anything. Could be nothing. Could be the kind of news that arrived in envelopes and changed the shape of a life. The return address was a law office. Belham and Associates, Harwick County, Pennsylvania. The name meant nothing to Carla. She stood in the hallway of the shelter holding the envelope for a full minute before she opened it, aware in some wordless part of herself that the moment before knowing was the last moment she would have before whatever came next. The letter was written in formal legal language that took her 3 readings to fully parse. The short version was this. A woman named Ida Voss had died in September of that year, aged 87, at a state care facility in Harwick County. Ida Voss had no living children, no spouse, no siblings. She had one surviving relative, identified through probate research, a granddaughter by her late son, Marcus Voss, who had left Pennsylvania at 22 and never returned. That granddaughter was Carla Maria Reyes, née Voss, legally adopted under the surname Reyes by her mother's second husband when Carla was 4 years old. Ida Voss had left behind one asset, a property at 14 Hollow Creek Road, Harwick County, Pennsylvania. The property had been in the Voss family since 1931. It had been unoccupied for 11 years. There were no other heirs. If Carla wished to claim the inheritance, she needed to contact the office of Howard Belham, attorney, within 60 days. She read the letter a 4th time, standing in the hallway of the shelter while a television somewhere played the evening news and someone in the kitchen argued about the temperature of the soup. A house. There was a house. She did not allow herself to feel hope yet. She had learned, across 31 years of loving people who left and working jobs that ended and saving money that disappeared, that hope deployed too early was one of the cruelest things that could happen to a person. So she folded the letter carefully back into the envelope and placed it in the inside pocket of her jacket, right against her ribs, and went to find Lily. She called Howard Belham the following morning from the shelter's phone. He was a man who sounded like a comfortable life. Warm, unhurried, the voice of someone who had never had to count change in a doorway. He confirmed everything. The inheritance was real. The property was legally hers to claim. But he said, obligated to be candid with her about the condition of what she would be inheriting. 14 Hollow Creek Road had been, for most of its history, the Harwick County Asylum for the mentally ill. It was built in 1891 on 62 acres of land at the edge of a state forest. The institution had operated for 80 years, housing at its peak over 400 patients. It closed in 1971 following a federal investigation into conditions that Belham described, with evident discomfort, as deeply troubling. The buildings had stood empty since then. Ida Voss had acquired the property in a county land auction in 1978 for reasons no one had ever fully understood. She had paid her property taxes faithfully for 33 years before age and poverty made that impossible, and the county had been carrying the debt in abeyance ever since, uncertain what to do with land that no developer wanted and no government agency would touch. The outstanding tax debt was $68,000. There were, Belham added carefully, structural concerns. Several of the buildings on the property had deteriorating roofs. The main building, a Victorian-era structure of 4 stories, had been partially condemned in 2009 following a fire in the East Wing. The smaller outbuildings were in varying states of collapse. The land itself was sound, 62 acres with creek access and forest coverage. But the buildings were, in his measured legal language, significantly distressed. Carla asked if she could see it. Of course, he said. He would meet her there. She borrowed bus fare from Donna at the shelter, who gave it without being asked twice, and whose expression, as Carla walked out with Lily's hand in hers, was the expression of someone sending a person towards something that might not end well, but understanding there was nothing useful to say about that. The bus to Harwick County took 4 hours and stopped in 6 small towns on the way, each one slightly quieter than the last, the landscape shifting from the density of the city to the wide, indifferent spread of rural Pennsylvania in late October. Fields shorn down after harvest, stands of oak and maple going bare, a sky the color of old dishwater stretched from one flat horizon to another. Lily pressed her nose to the window the entire way. She had never been on a bus that long. She asked questions about the farms they passed, about why some silos were painted and some were plain metal, about whether the cows were cold. Carla answered each one as fully as she could, and the questions were a kind of rope she held on to, a line running back to the reason she was doing this. Belham met them at the end of Hollow Creek Road in a sensible car, wearing a coat that had seen many Pennsylvania winters. He was in his 60s, gray-haired, with the expression of a man who had handled difficult situations so many times that difficulty no longer surprised him, only sometimes saddened him. He shook Carla's hand and crouched briefly to introduce himself to Lily, who examined him with the frank assessment of a child determining whether an adult was worth trusting. He drove them down the road. It was less a road than a suggestion of one, gravel and mud and the memory of pavement, lined on both sides by trees that had grown over the years into a canopy. In October, without their leaves, the branches reached toward each other across the road like fingers that almost touched. And then the building appeared. It rose from the trees slowly, revealing itself piece by piece as the car moved forward. First the tower at the north end, octagonal, with a peaked copper roof gone entirely green with age. Then the roof line of the main building, that 4-story Victorian sprawl of brick and stone, with its high arched windows and the remnants of decorative ironwork along the eaves. Then the full facade, massive and symmetrical, the front entrance flanked by stone columns that still stood despite everything. A covered porch with a floor of cracked and heaved tile. Ivy had reclaimed most of the south wall. A massive oak tree had grown close enough to the building that one of its larger limbs had pushed through a third-floor window and simply continued growing inside. Lily said, very quietly, well, that was the only word Carla had for it, too. It was enormous. It was ruined. It was, even in its ruin, something. The bones of it, as Howard Belham walked them around the perimeter pointing out structural concerns and county code violations, were unignorable. For stories of solid brick, walls 2 feet thick in the original Victorian construction, a slate roof that had held for over 100 years in the sections that hadn't been compromised by the 2009 fire, stone foundations that a local inspector had evaluated as sound 12 years ago, before Belham had stopped commissioning inspections because there was no one to commission them for. 62 acres. A creek that ran along the eastern boundary, cold and clear. A stand of hardwood forest in the back 40 that a forester, Belham said, had assessed as containing timber worth approximately $90,000 if selectively harvested. 3 outbuildings besides the main structure, a stone carriage house, a brick utility building, and the remains of a greenhouse whose iron frame had survived while its glass had not. The east wing of the main building, where the fire had burned, was a total loss. 3 rooms on the 4th floor, 2 on the 3rd. The county had made her predecessor pay to have the most dangerous sections cordoned off, and Belham showed her the yellow tape and the chain-link fencing that marked the condemned area, a raw wound on the side of the building where smoke stains still darkened the brick above the empty windows. The rest of the building was another matter. Inside, through the main entrance, the original receiving hall ran the full width of the building, a high-ceilinged space with plaster walls and a floor of white hexagonal tile, cracked in places but intact in most. The plaster had water damage in the corners. The floor was thick with dust and debris, leaves blown in through broken windows, the scattered evidence of years of animal habitation. But the scale of the space was startling. The ceiling was 14 feet, and in the center, hanging by a single rusted chain, was a chandelier of wrought iron and cut glass, its crystals gray with dust but present, every single one of them, catching the thin October light that came through the damaged windows and breaking it into small cold rainbows on the floor. Lily pointed at the rainbows. She did not speak. She just pointed, and Carla understood. Belham walked them through the ground floor. The main corridor ran the length of the building, wide enough for 4 people to walk abreast, with high arched doorways leading off both sides into what had been administrative offices, examination rooms, a small library whose shelves still held books sealed shut by moisture and time. The staff dining room was intact, its long oak table still standing in the center under a ceiling that had shed its plaster and sheets, leaving the lath exposed like ribs. A kitchen behind it, large and industrial, its equipment stripped decades ago, but its bones, the built-in cabinetry, the stone floor, the enormous windows facing the south side of the property, still there and still remarkable. On the 2nd floor, patient rooms lined both sides of a corridor that went on so long it seemed to compress distance at the far end. Each room was small, 8 by 10, with a single window and a radiator that had not worked in half a century. The rooms were empty and identical and numerous, 38 on that floor alone, Belham said, from the original architectural plans. The 3rd floor was the same. The 4th floor, except for the burned east wing, had been the administrative floor in the later years of operation, with larger rooms, a records office, a conference room with a view over the forest that was, even now, even with the windows broken and the floor soft with rot in one corner, one of the more beautiful things Carla had seen. The sub-basement, Belham said, was not accessible. A section of the floor in the western corridor had compromised the stairwell access in 2004, and the county had sealed it. The architectural plans showed 2 levels below ground, a utility level and, below that, a foundation level that had been used for storage in the asylum's operating years. He had no current information about the condition of either. Carla stood in the records office on the 4th floor and looked out through a window with one pane broken and one intact, across 62 acres of trees going bare and the glint of the creek in the distance. The sky was wide and gray and somehow less oppressive here than it had been from the doorway of the laundromat. As if the space itself, just the sheer amount of it, made the sky feel like something other than a ceiling. She said, "What happens if I can't pay the tax debt?" Belham said the county would put the property to auction at the 60-day mark after probate closed. There had been one developer who had expressed interest twice over the years, a man named Gerald Purcell who ran a land acquisition company out of Pittsburgh. Both times, the county's asking price had been too high for a property with this level of remediation liability. But if it went to auction at a distressed price, Belham thought Purcell or someone like him would likely buy it, clear the buildings, and either develop the land or hold it as an investment. $68,000, Carla said. Yes, she had $3.42. Belham looked at her with the expression of a man who was very good at not showing what he thought about the situations he witnessed. He said that the property had been assessed, for tax purposes, at $220,000, which was almost certainly below actual market value for 62 acres with water access and forest coverage in Harwick County. but reflected the significant liability of the buildings. He said that there were programs, through the State Historic Preservation Office, that offered grants for the rehabilitation of documented historic structures. He said that the Harwick County Historical Society had been documenting the asylum for years as a site of local significance and might be a source of support. He said all of this in the careful way of a man who wanted to give her real information without giving her false hope. On the drive back to the road, Lily sat between them in the front seat and asked Belham if the building was haunted. He said, in all honesty, that he did not know. Lily considered this. She said she didn't think ghosts were real, but that if they were, they probably weren't very scary because they had just been people once. Belham said that was a very sensible view. Lily said she had read a lot of books. They stood on Hollow Creek Road in the October cold, while Belham gave Carla his card and the contact information for the Historical Society and a woman at the State Preservation Office. He thought it was worth calling. He shook her hand again and looked at her with a directness that said he was not going to pretend this was easy, but he was also not going to tell her it was impossible, because he had been a lawyer for 37 years, and he had stopped believing in impossible some time ago. After his car disappeared up the road, Carla stood with Lily's hand in hers and looked back down the long canopy of bare trees toward the building she could just barely see through the distance. Lily said, "Are we going to live there?" Carla said, "I don't know yet." Lily said, "I think we should." They took the bus back to the city. Carla spent the ride making notes on the back of the envelope the letter had come in. Not plans exactly, more like the shape of a problem, its dimensions, the places where it might give if you pressed in the right direction. She had 62 acres. She had buildings that 130 years of construction had made out of materials that didn't fail easily. She had a historical designation that meant money existed somewhere for rehabilitation, if she could find the access point. She had timber that was worth $90,000 on the stump. She had nothing else. But she had looked at the chandelier in the entrance hall, covered in dust and hanging from a single chain, and it had not fallen. It had been hanging there for decades, through fires and abandonment and the full weight of neglect, and it had not fallen. Something in her had registered that as information rather than coincidence. She called the Historical Society the next morning from Donna's office phone. The woman who answered was named Patricia Marsh, and she had clearly been waiting for exactly this call for a long time. Her voice went from professional courtesy to barely contained enthusiasm within the first 30 seconds of the conversation. She knew the property. Of course she knew the property. She had been documenting it for 11 years. She had a complete photographic archive, original architectural drawings from 1891, the full institutional records from the county courthouse, and a stack of grant applications she had written speculatively and never been able to submit because there was no owner to partner with. She said, "Come see me." Carla brought Lily on the train to Harwick County the following Thursday. Patricia Marsh met them at the Historical Society's office on Main Street, a narrow building packed floor to ceiling with filing cabinets and flat map drawers and the accumulated documentation of a county that took its own history seriously. She was in her 50s, compact and efficient, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead and the energy of someone who had been right about something important for a very long time and was now in the presence of a person who might finally be able to act on it. She spread photographs across the conference table. The asylum in 1891, newly constructed, its grounds immaculate, a formal garden laid out before the front entrance. The asylum in 1934, with a new utility wing added on the north side. The asylum in 1958, with 341 patients. The peak year, the grounds by then reduced to lawn and the garden long gone. And the asylum as it stood now, or as it had stood when Patricia last photographed it the previous spring, the ivy-covered south wall, the broken windows, the copper tower going green above the trees. She talked for an hour. Carla listened with the kind of attention she had not applied to anything except survival in longer than she could remember. The property's history was well documented and genuinely unusual. The Voss family had acquired it in 1978 through a combination of luck and stubbornness. Carla's great-grandmother Ida bidding against no one because no one else wanted 62 acres of institutional horror and liability. Ida had never made any formal plans for the property. She had paid her taxes, kept the county away, and refused every offer from every developer who approached her across 3 decades. When people asked her why, she said only that it belonged to the family, which was not an answer that made sense to anyone who heard it. Patricia said she had always suspected Ida knew something about the property that she did not share. There were references, in the county records, to a survey conducted in 1979, the year after Ida's purchase, that had never been formally filed. Patricia had found the surveyor's notes in the basement of the courthouse by accident, misfiled in a drawer of road easements, and the notes referenced a subterranean structure on the eastern portion of the property that matched no element of the asylum's architectural plans. The surveyor had flagged it for further investigation. No further investigation had ever been conducted. Carla asked Patricia what that meant. Patricia said she genuinely did not know, but she said it with the expression of someone who had been thinking about it for years. After the meeting, Carla and Lily walked down Main Street, Harwick County, in November. The storefronts quiet on a weekday, a hardware store and a diner, and a bakery, and a real estate office with listings in the window for farms and woodlots and properties that made city prices seem like fiction. Lily held Carla's hand and ate a cookie that the woman at the bakery had given her without charging, the way people in small towns sometimes did when they saw a child and felt something uncalculated. She said, "Mom, are we going to move here?" Carla looked at the street, at the quiet of it, at the way the mountains were visible at the end of every block. She said, "I'm thinking about it." She said it the way she said most things she had already decided. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The decision, when it crystallized, was not a single moment. It was a series of small calculations that aligned like tumblers in a lock, and then all gave way at once. The timber survey that a forestry company, after one phone call and a site visit, confirmed was accurate. $92,000 in selectively harvestable hardwood, done carefully over 2 years to avoid destroying the character of the forest. The State Historic Preservation Office, which had a grant program for endangered historic structures and had, as Patricia Marsh had implied, been sitting on an application waiting for an owner's signature for the better part of 3 years. The grant, if approved, would cover up to 40% of documented rehabilitation costs for the main building. The Historical Society had a board member who knew a structural engineer who would come out and do a preliminary assessment for cost, not as a favor, but because he had been wanting an excuse to see the property for years. The tax debt was still $68,000. The timber could cover it, but timber harvest took time, and the county needed payment before the 60-day mark, which was now 41 days away. Carla called every number on the list Belham had given her. She called the county tax assessor and asked whether a payment plan was available pending a timber contract. The assessor, a man named Kowalski who sounded as though he had been asked this question before and found it tiresome, said that no payment plan was available for inherited property in probate. The debt was due at the 60-day mark or the property went to auction. She called a bank about a bridge loan. The loan officer was polite and efficient and explained, without unkindness, that a loan against a property with an outstanding tax lien and significant structural liability was not something they could underwrite, particularly for an applicant with no income and no credit history to speak of. He wished her luck. She believed he meant it. She called 3 more banks and received variations on the same answer. She did not call her mother, who had moved to Florida 10 years ago and whose second husband had opinions about Carla's life choices that he shared freely and without invitation. She did not call her friend Marisol, who would have helped if she had anything to help with. She did not call anyone who would tell her to be practical, because she already knew exactly how practical her situation was, and the information was not useful. She sat in the shelter at 2 in the morning with the letter and the notes and the pages Patricia Marsh had copied for her, and the preliminary assessment from the engineer, who had come out on a Tuesday, and spent 4 hours in the building, and then stood in the receiving hall and said, quietly, to no one in particular, that they didn't build them like this anymore. She sat with all of it spread around her on the floor of the small room she shared with Lily, who was asleep with her arm around a stuffed dinosaur, and she thought about her grandmother, this woman she had never met, who had bought 62 acres of troubled history and paid taxes on it for 33 years and never explained why. She thought about Ida Voss bidding alone at a county auction in 1978, an old woman with no apparent reason to want a condemned asylum on the edge of a forest, and winning it because no one else wanted it. She thought about the surveyor's notes, the subterranean structure that didn't match the plans, She thought about the chandelier. The next morning, she called Patricia Marsh and asked if the Historical Society could co-sign the grant application, which would make it submittable within the week. Patricia said yes before Carla finished the sentence. She called the forestry company and asked if they could advance any portion of the timber contract against the pending payment. The man she spoke to, whose name was Dennis, said he would need to think about it. He called back 2 hours later and said that against the executed timber contract, he could advance $15,000 immediately, which was the most he could do without approval from his board. Carla said that helped. She meant it. She called Belham and asked about expedited probate. He said he would file the motion that afternoon. He charged her nothing. When she asked about his fee, he said he had known Ida Voss for 20 years and had never been able to figure out what she was holding on to. And if Carla was going to find out, he considered it part of his civic duty to help get her there. It was the kindest thing anyone had said to her in longer than she could measure. She had $15,000. She had a grant application in process. She had a timber contract that would ultimately pay the tax debt, and then some. She did not have the $68,000 due in 31 days. She was 41 days from losing the property before she could figure out what it was. That was when Gerald Purcell called. He got her number from the probate filing, which was public record. He called her cell phone on a Thursday afternoon while she was at the shelter's kitchen table helping Lily with her homework. His voice was warm and direct and made her think immediately of something smooth on the surface with something harder just underneath. He said he understood she had inherited a property in Harwick County. He said he had been interested in that property for some time and wanted to make sure she was aware of her options. He said the property came with significant liability and that he could offer her a clean exit. No need to deal with the tax debt, the structural issues, the remediation costs. He would handle everything. She would walk away with something rather than nothing. He paused to let her ask how much. She did not ask. She said she had received his message and would be in touch if she had any questions. He said he hoped she understood the timeline. He said the 60-day mark was approaching quickly and that after that, the property would likely go to auction, at which point any offer he might be able to make her would be substantially lower. He said this in the careful way of someone who wanted the information to sound like helpfulness rather than threat. Carla said she understood the timeline. She thanked him for calling. After she hung up, Lily asked who that was. Carla said it was a man who wanted to buy the house. Lily said, "The big one with the tower?" Carla said yes. Lily said, "We're not selling it, right?" Carla looked at her daughter, 7 years old, who had spent her entire conscious life in temporary places and had seen the house with the tower once, in October, through the windows of a car, and had decided with the absolute simplicity of childhood that it belonged to them. She said, "No, we're not selling it." She had 28 days and no clear path. What she had instead was the particular stubbornness that had kept her employed through 15 years of jobs that didn't last, that had kept her daughter fed and in school and believing the world was manageable even when it wasn't. The kind of stubbornness that doesn't announce itself because it doesn't need to. The kind that simply does not stop. She went back to Harwick County the following week, this time to stay. She and Lily moved into the Carriage house on the property, the stone outbuilding that the structural engineer had assessed as sound in its primary structure and weathertight enough to be habitable with minor repairs. Carla spent the first 2 days patching gaps in the mortar with material she bought at the hardware store on Main Street, hanging a door that had been left leaning against the interior wall for what looked like decades, and rigging a temporary heating arrangement with a propane unit that Dennis from the forestry company had lent her without being asked. The Carriage house had no running water. There was a hand pump at the back of the property, connected to the same well system that had served the asylum, which the county had tested the previous year and found clean. Carla carried water in 2 5-gallon jugs every morning. Lily helped without complaint and made a game of counting her steps from the pump to the Carriage house. The record was 104 steps, which she announced with genuine pride and wrote on the wall beside the door with a marker, signing it with her name. The main building watched them from 200 yards away. Every morning, Carla went into it. Sometimes with Patricia Marsh, sometimes with the engineer, sometimes alone. She walked every room of every floor she could safely access, learning the building the way you learned any large and complicated thing, in pieces that slowly assembled into a whole. She began to understand its logic. The way the original Victorian architects had thought about light and air, orienting the wards to catch morning sun. The way later editions had compromised that logic, adding institutional bulk without institutional grace. The way the building resisted its own abandonment, the slate roof holding where it mattered, the brick walls refusing to crack despite the freeze-thaw cycles of 100 Pennsylvania winters. She found things in the rooms. Not treasures. The ordinary evidence of lives lived in an institution. A shoe, single, brown leather, child-sized, under the radiator in a room on the 3rd floor. A stack of paper-covered composition books in a locked cabinet in the records office. The lock yielded to a screwdriver. The books full of handwriting in pencil. Patient observations written by staff in a year Carla could not make out because the first page was missing. A small framed photograph on a windowsill in what had been the nurse's station, showing a group of staff outside the front entrance. Dated 1952, their expressions arranged in the formal neutrality that photographs of that era required of people who worked in places that the world preferred not to look at. She stood in the sub-basement stairwell, behind the county's sealed door, and looked down into the darkness and thought about the surveyor's notes. On the 22nd day, with 6 days left until the deadline, the grant application came back from the State Preservation Office with a preliminary approval for $42,000. It was not final. It required a co-signature, a site inspection, and a formal rehabilitation plan. But it was real, and it was in writing. And when Carla brought it to the county tax assessor's office and laid it on Kowalski's desk alongside the executed timber contract and the $15,000 advance from Dennis, Kowalski looked at the documents for a long time in silence. He was a man who had spent 20 years processing the paperwork of small rural counties, watching properties lost and saved and sold and condemned and occasionally, rarely, rescued by people who refused to accept the standard outcomes. He looked at the grant letter and the timber contract and the woman sitting across from him in a coat that had seen better winters, and something shifted in his face, very slightly, in the direction of a decision. He said the county could accept the $15,000 advance as a good faith payment and hold the auction pending proof of the grant disbursement, which would need to arrive within 90 days. Carla said, "Put it in writing." He did. She walked out of the county building into the thin November sunlight and stood on the sidewalk and allowed herself, for the first time and longer than she could remember, to feel something in the direction of okay. Not safe. Not solved. Not anywhere near the end of anything. But okay. Present tense, contingent, cautious, real. 6 days later, Gerald Purcell called again. She let it go to voicemail. He said he had heard she was staying on the property and he respected her determination but wanted her to understand that his offer, which had been generous given the liability involved, was not going to remain available indefinitely. He said he had been patient because he respected Ida Voss, had known her slightly, had always found her a formidable woman. He said he hoped Carla had her grandmother's good sense along with her stubbornness. He said it in the way of someone who considered good sense and stubbornness to be opposites. Patricia Marsh was at the Carriage house when Carla played the voicemail. She listened to it with an expression Carla was beginning to recognize, the expression Patricia wore when something confirmed a suspicion she had been carrying for years. She said, "He knew Ida." Carla said, "That's what he said." Patricia said, "That's interesting. Because in 33 years, Ida never mentioned him. Not once. In any of the conversations Patricia had managed to have with her in the final years when the old woman was still accessible and still occasionally willing to talk. Ida talked about the property. She talked about the Voss family history. She talked about reasons she had, she said, for keeping the land that she wasn't able to explain yet. But she never mentioned Gerald Purcell. Why would she avoid mentioning a man who had made multiple offers on her property over 30 years? Carla looked at the Carriage house wall where Lily had written her record of 104 steps. She said, "What do you know about the sub-basement?" Patricia pulled out her folder of architectural drawings and spread them on the table. The original plans, 1891, showed 2 subterranean levels. The upper basement was standard, utility systems, and storage. The lower level, what the plans called the foundation level, was marked on the drawings. Only as storage. But the surveyor's notes from 1979 had described something that didn't match storage. They had described a vault. Not metaphorically. Not as a general term for a secure space. The surveyor had used the specific word vault and noted its construction as reinforced concrete. Exterior dimensions approximately 40 feet by 20 feet. with a ventilation system that was, in 1979, still functional. He had noted the existence of a steel door, original fitting, and a combination lock mechanism. He had noted that the key for the mechanism was not in evidence. He had noted that Ida Voss had been present during the survey, had been present and had asked him, afterward, to exclude this structure from the formal filed survey, had asked him to note it only in his personal records and to say nothing about it. The surveyor, apparently a man of either unusual integrity or unusual caution, had kept the record in his personal files, and it had ended up, through the ordinary chaos of paperwork and time, in a courthouse drawer where it sat for 44 years until Patricia Marsh found it by accident. Carla sat with the architectural drawings and the surveyor's notes and looked at the measurements. 40 feet by 20 feet. Reinforced concrete. Ventilation still functional in 1979. Steel door. Combination lock. She said, when was the East Wing fire? Patricia said 2009. Carla said, and the stairwell access to the sub-basement was compromised when? Patricia checked her records. 2004, she said. The stairwell had collapsed 5 years before the fire. Not because of the fire. Before it. Carla looked at her. Patricia looked back. They did not say what they were both thinking, because saying it out loud felt like something that could not be unsaid, a commitment to a possibility so large that speaking it required believing it was real. Instead, Carla said, I need to get into that sub-basement. The engineer, whose name was Robert Cates and who had by this point made 4 visits to the property and billed for none of them because he had stopped pretending this was a normal engagement, came out the following morning. He examined the compromised stairwell with a flashlight and a tape measure and the particular silence of a man calculating variables. He said the stairwell structure was not actually collapsed. The ceiling of the stairwell had partially dropped, blocking safe passage, but the stairwell itself was intact. With a hydraulic jack and 2 hours of careful work, he could probably create a passage wide enough for a person to move through. He said probably. He said this with the emphasis of a professional covering liability. Carla said, let's find out. Lily was in school, the elementary school in town where Patricia had helped her enroll the week before, sitting in a classroom, learning multiplication tables, and telling her new classmates about the house with the tower. Carla and Robert Cates spent the morning with a hydraulic jack and 4x4 lumber blocking and the kind of careful physical work that required attention and produced results. The fallen section of the stairwell ceiling lifted in increments. Robert watched the surrounding structure with the focus of someone who knew exactly what a wrong move looked like and how quickly it announced itself. By noon, there was a passage. Not comfortable, not wide, but passable. Carla pulled on work gloves and a headlamp and moved through it. The stairwell descended 12 steps to the utility basement, a low-ceilinged concrete space with the remains of the original heating system, massive iron boilers gone cold for 50 years, their pipes running up through the ceiling in patterns that had once distributed warmth through 4 floors of brick. She moved through the utility basement carefully. The floor was sound, the concrete walls unchanged by decades except for a thin mineral deposit where water had once seeped and then stopped. At the far end of the utility basement, a second stairwell descended. She went down. The lower level was different. The ceiling was higher here, 8 feet instead of 6, and the construction was heavier. The walls were poured concrete, not block, 2 feet thick by the look of the revealed edges where a section had cracked and been repaired at some point. Repaired with care, someone had been down here and maintained this. The floor was dry. The air was cool and still and carried no smell of rot or water or the biological evidence of long abandonment. The ventilation system the surveyor had noted was still working. Somewhere in the walls, air was moving. She walked the length of the corridor to the steel door. It was exactly as the surveyor had described. Heavy-gauge steel, original fittings, a combination dial in the center, the kind of mechanism that required a specific sequence to open. The metal was clean, not corroded, not rusted. Someone had treated it, regularly, over years. The hinges were oiled. Carla stood in front of the door in the light of her headlamp and put her hand flat against the metal. It was cold and solid and utterly silent. She thought about Ida Voss, who had bought 62 acres of troubled history and paid taxes on it for 33 years and never explained why, who had kept the surveyor's secret for 44 years, who had left this land to a granddaughter she had never met, and who had, apparently, known exactly what she was doing. She stood there for a long time. Then she went back up through the stairwell and out into the November afternoon and called Howard Belham. She said, "I need everything Ida Voss ever owned. Every document, every key, everything she had when she died." Belham said, "She died with very little. The estate was almost nothing." Carla said, "Almost." Belham was quiet for a moment. He said, "There was a safety deposit box at the bank here in Harwick. I have the key." She left instructions that it was to be opened only by her heir, not by the executor. He said it with the expression of a man who had been holding this piece of information for 4 months and had been wondering, every day, what was in it. Carla said, "I'll be there in an hour." She drove Belham's loaner car into town with her hands steady on the wheel and the headlamp still pushed up on her forehead and the dust of the sub-basement still on her jacket sleeves. She parked in front of the bank and sat for one moment in the car, in the ordinary November afternoon of a small Pennsylvania town, with the mountains visible at the end of the street and the leaves entirely gone now from the trees and the sky going pale in the late afternoon light. She thought about the cardboard box outside the laundromat. She thought about $3.42. She thought about a chandelier that had hung from a single chain for decades and not fallen. She went inside. The safety deposit box was small, the standard size, and it took the key to open. Inside was a single envelope, cream-colored and sealed, with Carla's name on the front and handwriting she did not recognize, but recognized as the same script as the formal letter she had received at the shelter 4 months ago. Below her name, written in smaller letters, a note, "For when you are ready." She opened it at the counter, under the fluorescent lights of the bank lobby, with a teller watching politely from behind the counter and Belham standing at a respectful distance. Inside the envelope were 2 things: a letter, handwritten, 3 pages in a small close script, and a piece of paper with a sequence of numbers. She read the letter first. "My dear Carla," the letter began, "I have written this many times and torn it up because I kept trying to explain everything before I told you the important part, and the important part is this. What I found on that land, I found for you, not for me. I have been too old and too alone to use it, and using it wrong would have been worse than not using it at all. But you are young, and from what I understand of you, you are strong in the way that matters, not the way that doesn't get tired, but the way that keeps going when it is tired. The rest of the letter can wait. Go to the door." The number sequence on the separate piece of paper was 12 digits long. Carla folded both pieces of paper and put them in her inside pocket, right against her ribs, in the place where the first letter had ridden for the past 4 months. She said to Belham, "I need to go back to the property." He said, "I'll drive you." The late afternoon light was going orange by the time they parked at the edge of the Carriage house, and Carla walked back across the ground toward the main building. Patricia Marsh's car was there, and Patricia was standing by the entrance, and when she saw Carla's face, she didn't say anything, just fell in a step beside her. Robert Cates was still on site, talking to Dennis from the forestry company, who had come by to check on the timber survey. They followed without being asked. Carla led them down through the passage in the stairwell, through the utility basement, and down the second staircase to the lower level. She stopped in front of the steel door. She took out the piece of paper with the 12-digit number. The lock had 6 positions on the dial, 2 digits per position. She turned the dial slowly in the silence of the lower level, Belham behind her with a flashlight, Patricia with her hand against her mouth, Robert Cates watching the ceiling out of professional instinct, Dennis standing very still. She entered the final 2 digits. For a moment nothing happened. Then there was a sound from inside the door, a deep mechanical motion, the tumblers of a lock that had been waiting for decades turning over one by one in the quiet dark. The door swung open. The air that came out was cool and dry and carried something that was not quite a smell, an absence of the outside world, the sealed preservation of something held in suspension for a very long time. Carla stepped forward into the light of Belham's flashlight and looked. She looked for a long time without speaking. Behind her, Patricia Marsh made a sound she would later describe, to anyone who asked, as the sound a person made when they spent 11 years believing something impossible was true and then found out they had been right. The room was 40 feet long and 20 feet wide, exactly as the surveyor had measured, and it was full. Not cluttered, not haphazardly stuffed the way storage rooms became when people used them as places to put things they did not want to think about. It was organized with the deliberate care of someone who had planned this over a long period of time and had understood, with complete clarity, what they were doing and why. Along the left wall, floor to ceiling, ran a series of wooden shelving units, old but well-constructed, the wood treated against moisture, each shelf holding rows of wooden crates sealed with wax along the lids. Along the right wall, flat wooden cases stacked 4 deep, each one roughly the size of a large painting, which was what they turned out to be. In the center of the room, on a long table of heavy oak that must have been assembled in the space because there was no way to get it through the door, sat a collection of objects arranged with museum precision. Small carved figures, ceramic vessels, ornamental pieces in materials that caught the light of Bellum's flashlight and threw it back in ways that gold and silver and polished stone did when the light found them right. Carla stood in the doorway and looked at all of it and did not speak. Robert Cates put his hand against the wall and said, "The ventilation system is still running. Someone designed this space to maintain stable temperature and humidity. This wasn't storage. This was conservation." Patricia Marsh walked to the nearest wooden crate, read the markings on the lid, and went very still. She said the markings were consistent with a cataloging system used by European museum collections in the early 20th century. Bellham said, slowly, "What are we looking at?" Nobody answered him yet. Not because they didn't want to. Because none of them were ready to say it out loud until they understood it well enough to say it accurately. Carla walked to the center table and stood over the nearest object. It was a ceramic vessel, approximately 8 inches tall, with a narrow neck and a body decorated in a continuous painted scene. The figures in the scene were stylized in the way of ancient Greek pottery, red figures on black, athletes or warriors or gods, she could not tell which, caught in motion by a painter who had been dead for 2,500 years. The vessel sat on a small wooden base that bore a paper label, handwritten in a formal European script, with a reference number and 2 words she recognized from a school trip to a city museum when she was 9 years old. Attic Lekathos. She picked up the nearest flat case from the stack along the right wall, carefully, and laid it on the floor. The latches were brass, green with age but functional. She opened it. Inside, cushioned between layers of archival board that had kept its shape across decades, was a painting, approximately 18 inches by 24. Oil on panel. A portrait, a woman seated at a table with a small dog in her lap, her expression one of composed attention, her clothing placing her in the Northern European merchant class of the 16th or early 17th century. The paint surface was intact. The colors, reds and deep browns, and the particular lead white of that era, were present and unfaded. In the lower right corner, barely visible, the initials of the artist, 2 letters intertwined. Patricia Marsh was beside her. She looked at the painting for a long time without speaking. Then she said 2 words in a voice so quiet Carla almost missed them. Dutch Golden Age. She said it like a person confirming something they had spent years suspecting. Bellham said again, and with more urgency, "What are we looking at?" Patricia turned to face him. She said, she was not certain. She said that to be certain would require proper lighting and examination by qualified conservators. She said that the markings on the crates were consistent with pre-war European provenance documentation. She said the ceramic vessels on the center table, if authentic, represented museum-quality ancient Greek and Roman artifacts. She said the paintings, if what she believed them to be, were significant. She said significant the way people said significant when they meant something larger than the word usually carried. Carla asked, "How many crates?" Robert counted methodically, moving along the shelving units with his flashlight. He said 47. "How many painting cases?" 31. Carla looked at the center table. There were 11 objects arranged on it, each on its individual base, each with its paper label. She said, "We need to close the door." They came back up through the sub-basement and the utility basement and the passage and the stairwell and out into the cold that was deepening now toward evening. The sky above the property going dark blue at the edges and pale gold where the sun had been. They stood in the frozen grass outside the main building and none of them spoke for a long moment. Then Dennis said, very carefully, that he didn't think he was supposed to be part of whatever was happening here, and he was going to go home and not say anything to anyone, and he shook Carla's hand with both of his and drove away without looking back. Bellham said he needed to make some calls. He said this with the expression of a man who had practiced law for 37 years and had just encountered something that was going to require more expertise than he possessed. He asked Carla if she trusted him. She said yes. He said that was probably the right decision and he would be back in the morning. Patricia stayed. She helped Carla make dinner in the Carriage house on the propane stove, moving around the small space in the careful way of someone whose mind was elsewhere. Lily came home from school on the bus, full of news about a girl in her class who had a rabbit, and found two adults in the kitchen who were both present in their bodies, but clearly not in their heads, and accepted this with the adaptability of a child who had learned that adults sometimes needed time. After Lily was asleep, Patricia sat at the table with her hands around a mug of tea and said, "I need to tell you what I think I know, because I think you deserve to know it before it becomes public, which it will, and soon." Carla said, "Tell me." Patricia said that the cataloging system on the crates was one used by several major European museums and also by certain private collectors in the period between the two world wars. She said that in the years during and immediately after the Second World War, an enormous quantity of art and cultural objects had been displaced, moved, hidden, stolen, lost. She said that the Allies had assembled teams of experts, the monuments men as they had come to be known, to locate and repatriate these objects after the war ended. She said that despite extraordinary effort, a significant portion of what had been taken never returned to its rightful owners. Some was known to exist, but unlocated. Some was simply gone. She said the crates in the sub-basement were marked with a numerical system she associated with the collection of a private German collector, a man named Friedrich Hartmann, who had assembled one of the most significant private art collections in Europe in the 1920s and 1930s. Hartmann had died in 1943, in circumstances that were unclear in the historical record. His collection had been documented by Allied investigators after the war as partially missing. What had been recovered and repatriated was a fraction of what the pre-war documentation showed he had owned. Carla said, "How does it get from a dead German collector's house to a sub-basement in Pennsylvania?" Patricia said that was the question she had been asking herself since she found the surveyor's notes. She said that the Voss family had emigrated from Germany in 1931, that the property at 14 Hollow Creek Road had been purchased by a Voss family member, a man named Ernst Voss, in 1931, that the asylum itself had been purchased in 1978 by Ida Voss, who was Ernst Voss's daughter-in-law. She said she did not know the full story, but she said she thought the beginning of it was a German family who had left before the war, who had taken with them certain objects that did not belong to them, who had hidden those objects in the most unlikely place they could find, an abandoned asylum that no one wanted, and who had spent the subsequent decades caught between the impossibility of using what they had and the impossibility of giving it up. She said she thought Ida Voss had spent 33 years keeping this secret, paying for land she could not use, waiting for something she could not name, and had eventually decided that the only thing to do with a secret this large was to give it to someone who was young enough and unencumbered enough and had enough reason to get it right. Carla sat with this for a long time. She said, "Get it right means what?" Patricia said, "I think it means returning it to the people it belongs to." If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The first expert arrived 3 days later. Belham had called a former law school colleague who now worked in art law in New York, a woman named Claire Adler who arrived in Harwick County in a car that cost more than the annual tax assessment on the property, and who walked through the sub-basement vault with the focused attention of someone cataloging a situation rather than reacting to it. She wore gloves. She took photographs. She made notes in a small leather book. She did not speak until she had completed 2 full circuits of the room. Then she said, "Mr. Belham, you were right to call me." She said it with the particular restraint of a professional for whom understatement was a form of precision. She spent the remainder of that day and the following morning examining the crates, opening each one with Carla's permission, photographing the objects within, recording the markings on the lids and the paper labels inside. The crates held ceramics, bronze figures, decorative metalwork, carved ivory, a collection of illuminated manuscript pages in a flat archival box, 24 small paintings on wood panel, a collection of ancient coins in individual mounts, a set of Roman glass vessels that had survived 2 millennia, and a transatlantic crossing and several decades of sub-basement storage without losing so much as a chip. The flat painting cases held larger works. Oils on canvas, oils on panel, one work on copper. Dutch and Flemish masters of the 17th century, 2 Italian works of the 16th century, a small German panel painting that Claire Adler stood in front of for 4 full minutes, without moving before writing something in her leather book with an expression of concentrated effort. On the second morning, she came to the Carriage house and sat at the table and laid her notes in front of her and told Carla what she had found. She said the collection in the sub-basement represented, to her preliminary assessment, one of the most significant private collections of European art and antiquities she had ever encountered outside of a major museum. She said the ceramics and bronze figures were consistent with authentic ancient Greek and Roman pieces of high quality. She said the illuminated manuscript pages appeared to be genuine medieval works. She said the paintings, if her attributions held under full expert examination, included works by artists whose individual pieces routinely appeared at major auction houses with estimates in the millions. She said the total value, properly authenticated and appraised, was not something she could estimate with any precision at this stage, but that she would be surprised if it fell below $200 million, and that it could be considerably more. She said this last sentence in the same tone she used for everything else. Calm and exact. The tone of a professional who understood that the number itself was not the point. Carla sat across from her and said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "What happens now?" Claire said that was, in many respects, the most complicated question involved. She said the legal and ethical landscape of displaced wartime art was one of the most contested areas of international law. She said that depending on the provenance of individual pieces, there could be surviving heirs of original owners with valid claims. There could be claims by the governments of countries from which the objects had been taken. There could be competing claims between institutions and families. She said that the process of sorting through those claims, piece by piece, with full scholarly documentation, could take years. She said, and I want to be direct with you, that there were people in the world who would argue that Carla, as the legal owner of the property on which these objects were found, had a claim of her own, and that navigating that claim alongside the ethical obligations involved in provenance research was genuinely complicated territory that required serious legal guidance. Carla asked, "And you can provide that guidance?" Claire said that her firm specialized in exactly this kind of work, that they had handled displaced art cases for 40 years, that they had relationships with the major provenance research organizations and the legal frameworks of most of the relevant countries. She said they could manage the process in a way that served both the legitimate claims of original owners and the legitimate interests of the person who had brought the collection to light. She said she was also obligated to disclose that Gerald Purcell had called her office 3 weeks ago, before Carla's inheritance was even filed, asking questions about the Harwick County Asylum property and the legal status of objects found on private land. Carla said, "He knew." Claire said she believed so. Yes. She said that Purcell had never disclosed what specifically he was interested in, only that the property had potential value beyond its real estate assessment. She said she had declined to provide advice at that stage because there was no client to advise. She said she was disclosing it now because Carla deserved to know the full picture. Carla looked at the Carriage house wall, where Lily's record of 104 steps was still written in marker. She thought about Gerald Purcell's voice on the phone, warm and careful and positioned just inside the line between helpful and threatening. He had known. He had known for long enough to call a New York art law firm before the probate was even filed, which meant he had known before Ida died, which meant Ida had known he knew. She said to Claire, "If I begin this process, the provenance research, the repatriation, everything, can we keep it quiet until we have a clear picture of what's here?" Claire said she could manage the initial phase with discretion. She said that at some point, as institutions and families were contacted, it would become public. But the early stages, the research, the authentication, the documentation, could be done without announcement. Carla said, "How long?" Claire said 3 months, perhaps 4, before the first notifications to potential claimants would need to go out. After that, the pace would be determined by the claimants themselves. Carla said, "Start." The authentication team arrived 2 weeks later. For specialists, a ceramics expert from Philadelphia, a paintings conservator from New York, an antiquities scholar from a university in Boston, and a provenance researcher who had spent 20 years tracing displaced wartime art through European archives. They worked in the sub-basement for 6 days, examining every object, photographing everything, taking samples where sampling was appropriate, building the documentation that would eventually support or challenge Claire Adler's preliminary assessments. Carla was present every day. She watched the specialists work the way she had watched Robert Cates work on the stairwell, with the attention of someone learning a vocabulary they did not yet speak. She asked questions when they would not interrupt, and the experts, who had collectively spent their careers working in institutions that valued access over explanation, found themselves explaining things in unusual detail because Carla asked questions that required actual answers. The ceramics expert, a woman named Dr. Yun, showed her how the kiln marks on the base of the attic lekythos were consistent with 5th century Athenian production, how the paint composition matched the known chemistry of the period, how the wear patterns on the base suggested genuine age rather than artificial distressing. The provenance researcher, a man named Sokolov who had grown up hearing his grandparents talk about what they had lost, examined the paper labels on the crates with an expression that was professional and personal at once, and told Carla that the numbering system was a modification of one used by the Kunsthandel firm of a dealer named Giesler, who had operated in Munich between 1925 and 1940, and that Giesler's records were partially preserved in an archive in Nuremberg and would be the first place he looked. Lily came home from school each afternoon and checked what was happening in the basement through questions rather than visits, because Carla had told her clearly that the basement was for the specialists right now. She accepted this and channeled her curiosity into a running interrogation of Carla each evening over dinner, asking detailed questions about ceramics and provenance and Dutch Golden Age painters that her classmates were unlikely to find interesting, but that she had decided were fascinating because her mother's face changed when she talked about them. On the 4th day, the provenance researcher found something in the labeling of one of the crates that made him go quiet for an extended period and then come upstairs to find Carla directly rather than sending a message through Claire. He said he had found a marking on 3 of the crates that he believed corresponded to the documented collection of a Jewish family named Weisberg from Frankfurt, Germany, who had owned a significant art collection that had been seized by the Nazi government in 1938 as part of the organized confiscation of Jewish-owned property. The Weisberg family had escaped to England in 1939. The post-war documentation showed that they had filed claims for their collection with the Allied Repatriation Office, but had never recovered the majority of what was taken. The last surviving member of that family, a woman named Hannah Weisberg Friedman, had died in 1987 in London. She had a daughter and 2 grandchildren. He said this carefully, watching Carla's face. She said, "You have contact information?" He said the provenance organizations maintained heir registries. Finding them was part of his work. He said he could have contact details within a week. She said, "Find them." The news of Gerald Purcell reached her through Belham, who had been quietly monitoring the situation from the legal perspective of a small-town attorney who had abruptly found himself adjacent to something very large. Purcell had filed a legal challenge to the probate, claiming that the conditions of the inheritance had not been properly established and that the property's value had not been fully disclosed to the county assessor. It was, Belham said, a technical challenge with limited merit, the kind of thing filed not because it was likely to succeed but because it created delay and uncertainty and pressure. He also said that Purcell had hired 2 lawyers from Pittsburgh, both of whom had backgrounds in estate and property law, and that the filing had arrived at the county court on the same day, within hours of the authentication team's first vehicle being seen on the road to the property. Carla said, "He has someone watching the road." Belham said he believed so. She thought about this. She thought about Ida Voss, who had paid taxes on 62 acres of land for 33 years while a man watched from a distance and waited. She thought about the kind of patience that required, the kind of resolve. She said, "What do we need to do to get the challenge dismissed?" Belham said he would handle it. He said it with a confidence that surprised her, given that he was a small-town attorney going up against Pittsburgh lawyers, and she said so. He said that he had spent 37 years in Harwick County and that he knew the county court and the county judge and the county assessor's office and every procedural mechanism available in this jurisdiction, and that a man from Pittsburgh who thought he could file a technical challenge against a legitimate probate and have it stick was welcome to find out how wrong he was. He said it with the mild satisfaction of a man who had been underestimated before and found the experience useful. The challenge was dismissed in 11 days. Purcell called her again the day after the dismissal. His voice had shed some of its warmth. Not all of it. He was too controlled for that, but enough that the architecture underneath was visible. He said he understood she had some assistance from legal counsel in New York. He said he had contacts at several institutions who would be very interested to know what was on that property. He said that the process of dealing with disputed provenance items was lengthy and expensive, and that he had the resources to participate in that process in ways that she did not. He said all of this in the tone of someone explaining how the world worked to someone who did not yet understand. Carla said she appreciated the call, and she would be in touch if she had any questions. She hung up. Then she called Claire Adler and asked whether there was any mechanism by which Purcell could insert himself into the repatriation process. Claire said no, not legally. The process involved the current legal owner of the property, the authenticated claimants, and the relevant legal frameworks. A third party with no ownership claim and no provenance connection had no standing. She said, unless he finds a way to acquire ownership of the property. Carla said, is that possible? Claire said it was not, as long as the property remained legally Carla's and the tax situation remained current. She said the dismissal of the probate challenge had closed that avenue. She said that Purcell was a man who was used to acquiring things through persistence and resource, and that the current situation gave him no lever to pull, which was probably making him uncomfortable. She said it the way a doctor described a contained infection. Serious, but manageable. The first authentication results came back on a Thursday morning, 6 weeks after the specialists had completed their initial examination. Dr. Yun's assessment of the ceramics was unambiguous. Of the 42 ceramic and bronze objects on the center table, 39 were authentic ancient pieces of high quality. 3 were likely later copies, fine quality but not ancient. The illuminated manuscript pages were genuine medieval work, consistent with production in a Northern European scriptorium in the 13th or 14th century. The ancient coins were authentic, a collection assembled with consistent taste across multiple Mediterranean cultures. The painting's assessment arrived the following day. The painting's conservator and the attribution specialist had worked through the flat cases methodically, and their report ran to 47 pages. Carla read it at the Carriage house table while Lily slept, with Patricia Marsh beside her and Claire Adler on the phone from New York. 31 paintings. Of the 31, 28 were attributed with high confidence to named artists of the Dutch, Flemish, and Italian schools of the 16th and 17th centuries. 2 were attributed to named artists with moderate confidence, pending further examination. 1 was attributed to a workshop rather than a named master. Among the 28 high-confidence attributions were 3 works attributed to Jan van Huysum, the Dutch still-life painter whose flower paintings appeared at auction with estimates in the $5 to $8 million range. 2 works attributed to Peter de Hooch, the Delft interior painter. 1 work attributed to Jacob van Ruysdael, the landscape master. 1 small panel painting attributed to Hans Holbein the Younger, the German portraitist who had painted Henry VIII and the court of Europe, and whose authenticated works were among the most valuable Northern European paintings in existence. Claire read the Holbein attribution aloud from the report, and then was quiet for a moment before saying that this would require additional examination by the leading Holbein scholars. She said that if the attribution held, the painting alone represented a discovery of international significance. Patricia Marsh said, quietly, into the silence of the Carriage house, that Ida Voss had sat on this for 33 years. Carla thought about an 87-year-old woman in a state care facility in Harwick County, dying with this knowledge, having spent 3 decades tending a secret she had inherited from people who had made choices she could not undo. She thought about what that cost, the weight of it, the particular loneliness of knowing something you could not use and could not share. She thought about the letter. What I found on that land, I found for you. She read the rest of Ida's letter that night, the parts she had deferred while the immediate crisis of the tax deadline consumed her attention. It filled in the history Patricia had outlined, but with the texture that only personal knowledge carried. Ernst Voss had been a young man in Frankfurt in 1930, working for a shipping company that handled crates of goods across the Atlantic. He had made contacts through that work. He had, in 1931, transported a collection of objects belonging to a man named Friedrich Hartmann, a collector who at that point was wealthy and connected and had no reason to anticipate what was coming, but who had, With the instinct of someone who had lived through one world war and could feel another gathering, arranged to move certain things out of Europe. Hartmann had died before he could retrieve them. The war came. The shipping company closed. Ernst Voss had come to America as part of the same arrangement and had found himself, in a country that was not his own, in possession of knowledge about a cache of objects he had no legitimate claim to and no way to return. He had bought the property on Hollow Creek Road in 1931 with money whose origin Ida's letter did not explain. He had, with the help of a local builder who asked few questions and was paid well for his silence, constructed the sub-basement vault. He had moved the collection into it. He had meant, Ida wrote, to do something about it. He always meant to do something about it. But the war complicated everything, and the post-war years complicated everything further, and eventually he died in 1962, having done nothing, having simply maintained the vault and paid the property taxes and told his wife, Carla's great-grandmother, what was in it. Ida had known since 1962, 29 years before she bought the property at auction in 1978. She had bought the property because she was the only person who knew what was in it, and she was not going to let it go to anyone who did not know and could not be trusted. She had spent 33 years after that trying to figure out what the right thing was. She had consulted a lawyer once, in the 1980s, and been told that the situation was legally complex and potentially exposing for the family. She had consulted a priest. She had consulted her own conscience, repeatedly, and without resolution, across 3 decades. She had gotten old and poor, and the property taxes had become impossible, and the path forward remained unclear. And then she had found out about Carla, a granddaughter she had never met, child of a son who had left and never come back, a young woman who was apparently getting by on her own without anyone's help and who had, by all available evidence, never had a single easy thing happen to her. She had looked at the situation for what it was, a secret too large for one old woman and a granddaughter who needed something larger than herself to fight for. She had made her plan. She had written her letter. She had died in September, and the letter had spent 4 months finding its way to a laundromat doorway on Mercer Street. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The Weisberg family made contact in February, 8 weeks after the Providence researcher had begun his search. Their names were Daniel Friedman and Sophie Friedman, Hannah Weisberg Friedman's grandchildren, living in London and Tel Aviv respectively. They spoke to Claire first, and then to Carla, on a video call that Carla took in the Carriage house on a Saturday morning while Lily was at a friend's house. Daniel Friedman was in his 40s, dark-haired, with the careful manner of a man approaching something that might disappoint him because he had been disappointed before. Sophie was younger, more direct, less practiced at concealing what she felt. She sat forward in her chair on the call and said, before anything else, "Can you tell us what you found?" Carla told them. She described the vault, the crates, the markings the Providence researcher had identified. She told them there were 3 crates that bore the marking his research associated with their family's documented collection. She told them the contents of those crates had been preliminarily assessed and included a collection of decorative metalwork and 2 small paintings. Sophie covered her mouth with her hand. Daniel said, "My grandmother never stopped believing the paintings would be found. Not until she died." Carla said, "I want you to know that those pieces are yours. Whatever the process requires, however long it takes, those pieces belong to your family." Daniel said, "You don't have to do that. Legally you might have." Carla said, "I know." There was a pause on the call that carried the weight of what she had just said. Sophie said, "Why?" Carla said, "Because your grandmother spent her whole life waiting for them. Because your family lost them to something that should never have happened. Because getting it right matters more than what I might be entitled to." She said it simply, without performance. It was just what she thought. Sophie started crying. Not loudly, just quietly, with the specific relief of someone who had been braced for the wrong outcome and received an unexpected one. Daniel said, "We would like to come to Pennsylvania to see them." Carla said, "Whenever you're ready." The Friedmans came in March. They arrived in Harwick County on a cold, bright day, rented car from Pittsburgh Airport, pulling up the road through the bare trees with the same tentative quality that Carla remembered from her first approach, as if the building appeared slowly enough to prepare you. She met them in front of the main entrance. Daniel shook her hand, and looked at the building with the expression of someone processing a great deal of information at once. Sophie stood still for a moment, looking at the facade, and said nothing. She led them down through the sub-basement to the vault. Their movements slowed as they descended, as if the weight of what they were approaching required a different pace. In the vault, she showed them the 3 crates the Provenance researcher had identified, open now, their contents laid on the examination table under the portable lighting the specialists had rigged. The decorative metalwork was a collection of silver pieces, candlesticks, a Sabbath plate, a kiddush cup, ritual objects whose use Carla had learned from Daniel's initial communication with Claire. They were elegant and old and had sat in a sealed room in Pennsylvania for over 80 years. The paintings were small, both of them. One was a landscape with figures. The other was a portrait of a young woman, her expression direct and unposed, her clothing placing her in Frankfurt at the turn of the 20th century. Daniel stood in front of the portrait for a long time. Then he said, "This is my grandmother. Before the war. She would have been about 20. He said it very quietly, to no one in particular. The way people said things they had been carrying so long that when they finally set them down, the moment was too large for volume. Sophie stood beside him. She reached out and touched the frame, not the paint, just the edge of the frame, and then withdrew her hand and stood with her arms crossed and her chin up in the way of someone holding something together inside. Carla watched them and understood something about why Ida Voss had kept this secret for 33 years. Not just the legal complexity, not just the family exposure, but the weight of knowing that somewhere, families were waiting. The impossibility of carrying that knowledge alone and the impossibility of setting it down. She understood, for the first time, what Ida's letter meant when it said getting it right mattered more than anything else. The authentication of the Holbein came through in April. 2 of the leading Holbein scholars in the world, brought in by the authentication team on Claire's recommendation, had examined the painting over 2 days and issued a joint assessment. The attribution was confirmed. The small panel painting in the sub-basement vault at 14 Hollow Creek Road, Harwick County, Pennsylvania, was an authentic work by Hans Holbein the Younger, painted circa 1532, and its existence was previously unknown to scholarship. The Provenance research placed it, through a chain of documentation that Sokolov assembled across 4 European archives, as part of the Hartmann collection. Friedrich Hartmann had purchased it in 1927 from a Berlin dealer. The work had no prior claims by dispossessed families. It had been, legally and ethically, Friedrich Hartmann's property, moved by arrangement before the war, never retrieved. Friedrich Hartmann had died without heirs. Claire called Carla the morning the assessment came through. She said there were legal questions about the ownership of objects belonging to individuals who died without heirs during the war, and that those questions varied in complexity depending on the country and the specific circumstances. She said that in the case of the Hartmann collection, the majority of pieces without surviving heir claims would, after full legal process, likely be considered the property of the current legal owner of the land on which they were found. She said this carefully, professionally, without inflection. Carla said, "And the Holbein?" Claire said the Holbein's most recent documented auction, a partial record from a 1924 sale, placed its value at a level that, adjusted for the century of appreciation in the old master's market, combined with the significance of the rediscovery and the perfection of its preservation, would make it one of the most significant auction offerings in recent memory. She said that the estimate, if it went to sale, would likely begin at $60 million. She said $60 million the way she said everything. Evenly. With precision. Carla sat in the carriage house with the phone against her ear and looked at the wall where Lily's record was written. 104 steps. She said, "When will we know the full picture? All the pieces, all the attributions, all the claims?" Claire said the Provenance research was approximately 60% complete. Some pieces were straightforward. Some required deeper archive work. She estimated another 4 months before the full picture was clear. She said, "What I can tell you now, at this stage, based on what we know and what we're likely to find, is that the collection your grandmother protected represents one of the most significant discoveries of displaced cultural property since the post-war repatriation efforts. The pieces with surviving heir claims will be returned to those families. There are currently 11 families in 4 countries whose claims we are actively researching. The pieces without surviving claims, after the full legal process, will constitute an asset of extraordinary value. She paused, the careful pause of someone choosing the next sentence with care. She said, I don't want to give you a number, because numbers at this stage are estimates and I believe in precision. But I want you to understand the scale of what your grandmother preserved, and what you chose to do with it. Carla looked out the small window of the Carriage house at the main building, that enormous Victorian ruin 200 yards away, its tower going green with copper in the spring light, its ivy-covered walls beginning to leaf out now that warmth had returned, the oak tree through the third-floor window putting out new growth into a room that had not seen growth in 60 years. She thought about a homeless woman on a cardboard box with $3.42. She thought about a letter in a shelter hallway. She thought about a chandelier that had not fallen. She said to Claire, when this is done, when the families have their pieces back and the process is complete, I want to do something with what remains here. With the property. I want to make it into something that belongs to people, not just to me. Claire said, what kind of something? Carla said she was still figuring that out. But she said she had 62 acres and a building that was, under the ivy and the damage, one of the most extraordinary structures she had ever stood inside. And she had a daughter who pointed at rainbows and thought the chandelier was worth saving. And she had a small town full of people, a lawyer who waived his fees and a forestry man who advanced against a timber contract and a woman who had been waiting 11 years for someone to show up and take the property seriously. She said, I think there's something here worth building. The news broke in May, 4 months after the authentication team had completed its work, through a leak that Claire traced to one of the institutional contacts Purcell had mentioned on his last call. A journalist from a Philadelphia paper ran a story with enough correct detail to confirm something significant had been found on a Harwick County property, though not enough to name the collection or the owner. Carla was in the hardware store on Main Street buying paint samples when her phone began filling with calls from numbers she did not recognize. She stood in the paint aisle and looked at the screen and thought about how the world was about to change again, faster now, in the way that public attention changed things regardless of whether you were ready. She called Patricia Marsh and said, it's out. Patricia said, I know. She said she was at the Historical Society and 3 journalists had already called her. Carla said, don't confirm anything. Patricia said she had said only that the property had historical significance and that the owner was working with appropriate legal and scholarly experts. She said it in the tone of someone who had been waiting for this conversation and had prepared. Carla called Claire. Claire said the timing was not ideal, but that they were prepared for it. She said they would issue a formal statement through her office that afternoon, confirming the discovery in general terms, emphasizing the provenance research process and the commitment to repatriation, and providing no details that would compromise the ongoing work with heir families who had not yet been formally contacted. She said, one more thing. She said Gerald Purcell had called her office that morning, within 2 hours of the story running, and had made an offer to purchase the property, through an intermediary, for $800,000. She said she had declined to relay the offer to Carla because she considered it to be what it was, which was a final attempt by a man who had run out of legitimate options to get something he had wanted for a long time and could no longer reach. She said, I wanted you to know he tried. Carla said, I know he did. She bought the paint samples, 3 shades of cream and 1 warm white, and drove back to the property on Hollow Creek Road, through the trees that were fully green now, the canopy complete overhead. She parked at the Carriage house and got out and stood for a moment looking at the main building. In 6 weeks, if the structural engineer's plan proceeded on schedule, the initial stabilization work on the east wing would begin. The collapsed sections would be made safe. The roof over the intact portions would be reinforced. The chandelier in the receiving hall would be cleaned and rehung on a new chain. Its cut glass returned to the job it had been doing for a century, which was taking whatever light came through the windows and making it briefly extraordinary. There was still a great deal she did not know. The full scope of what was in the vault, the precise legal outcome of the repatriation process, what the property could become, what she could build on 62 acres and a 130-year-old building, with resources she still could not entirely believe were real. What she knew was what she always knew. She was here. She was staying. And she had been left something worth taking care of. She went inside the Carriage house to start dinner before Lily came home. The Friedmans came back in June. this time with a cousin from Paris who had heard what was happening and driven to London and flown across the Atlantic, because there are moments in a family's history that you do not let pass without being present. His name was Etienne, and he was in his 60s, and he had spent his career as a professor of art history in ways that were, as he said, perhaps not entirely coincidental. He walked through the vault with the professional composure of someone who had spent 40 years looking at important art in important places, and then he stopped in front of the portrait of the young Hannah Weisberg and lost the composure entirely, in the quiet way that men who have maintained self-possession for 60 years sometimes did when they encountered the thing that finally asked too much of it. He said to Carla, "My grandmother's grandmother." She was 22 in this painting. He could not say anything else for a while. Carla stood to one side and let him have the silence. She had gotten better at that, at understanding that some of what was happening in these months was not hers to be part of, but only to make possible. That was the week Lily asked if they could repaint the receiving hall. She had been in the main building before, on guided tours with Patricia that had been sanctioned and supervised, and she had developed opinions about what needed doing. She presented them at dinner one Thursday evening with the organized clarity of a child who had been rehearsing. The receiving hall needed the water-stained plaster repaired and repainted in a color she had researched, which turned out to be the original color. Documented in an 1893 photograph Patricia had shown her, a warm cream. The chandelier should be cleaned because it was obvious. The tile floor could be fixed because there were people who fixed tile floors, and she had found 3 on the internet, and they all had good reviews. Carla asked where she had found money for all of this in her plan. Lily said the money was coming from the things in the basement. Carla said those decisions were complicated. Lily said, "I know, but some of them aren't." She was right, as she frequently was about things that adults complicated beyond their actual complexity. Some of the decisions were not complicated. The chandelier could be cleaned. The tile floor could be repaired. The plaster could be made right. Those were not decisions that required legal frameworks or provenance research or international consultation. They were decisions that required someone to care enough to do them. Carla started with the chandelier. She and Robert Cates spent a Saturday afternoon rigging a system to lower it safely from its chain without dropping it, and then spent 3 hours on the floor of the receiving hall with soft cloths and careful hands, cleaning a century of dust from 400 crystals of cut glass. Lily helped with the lower ones, approaching each crystal with the seriousness of a conservator, which was a word she had recently learned and was deploying frequently. Patricia documented the process photographically. The crystals emerged from their gray coating translucent and precise, the kind of glass that the Victorian era had made when it wanted something to last. When they raised it back on the new chain Robert had installed, and the afternoon light came through the damaged windows and found the clean glass, the receiving hall filled with the particular quality of light that cut glass in the right setting produced. Not a flood of it. Not obvious. Just the small insistence of color on plaster walls, brief and shifting with the angle of the sun, the room announcing that it had not forgotten what it was for. Lily stood in the middle of it with her arms out and her eyes up and said nothing at all. Carla looked at her daughter standing in a room full of refracted light in a building that had been abandoned for 50 years, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been unsettled for as long as she could remember. The tile work began the following week. A man named Aurelio, who had restored historic flooring for 20 years, arrived on a Monday with a truck full of matching hexagonal tiles sourced from a salvage supplier Patricia had tracked down through her preservation network. He worked methodically, removing the cracked pieces, grinding the substrate level, setting the replacements in a mortar that matched the original composition. He worked without commentary for 3 days, and then stood at the door on Friday afternoon and looked back at the floor, which now ran without interruption from one end of the receiving hall to the other, the repairs invisible except when you knew exactly where to look. He said, "Good bones." He said it to no one in particular, the way craftsmen said things when the work itself was the audience. The plaster work took longer. A conservator specializing in historic interiors came from Philadelphia and spent 2 weeks patching and feathering and matching the original lime-based compound so precisely that the repaired sections could only be found by the people who had repaired them. She painted the hall in the warm cream that the 1893 photograph documented, and then she left, and the receiving hall of the Harwick County Asylum, vacant for 53 years, looked for the first time like a room that was expecting someone. The full appraisal report arrived on a Wednesday in November, delivered to Claire Adler's office in New York and forwarded to Carla as a PDF that she opened on her phone standing in the kitchen of the Carriage house, while Lily ate breakfast, and the first real snow of the season came down outside the window in slow, deliberate flakes that meant business. The report was 63 pages. She read the executive summary first, the way Claire had told her to, and then she read it again. And then she put the phone face down on the counter and stood for a moment looking at the snow. $475 million. The number had been Claire's preliminary estimate for weeks, had been present in every conversation since October, had been given to her with professional precision and appropriate caveats about market conditions and auction timing and the particular unpredictability of Old Masters sales at the very high end. She had heard it enough times that it should have stopped feeling like something she needed to hold on to. It did not stop feeling that way. She picked the phone back up and read the line again, the one on page 2 of the executive summary, where the appraising firm had written, in the standard dry language of their profession, that the total estimated fair market value of authenticated objects with no outstanding provenance claims, as of the date of this assessment, was $475 million, with individual object estimates detailed in the appendices. She had $3.42 13 months ago. Lily said, "Mom, you're just standing there." Carla said, "I know." Lily said, "Is it the report?" Carla said, "Yes." Lily said, "Is it good news?" Carla thought about how to answer that. She thought about 9 families in 4 countries who had their pieces back. She thought about Sophie Friedman crying on a video call. She thought about an old man in Rotterdam holding a plate his grandmother had described to him every Christmas. She thought about a sealed room that had held its breath for 80 years, waiting for someone to get it right. She said, "Yes, it's good news." Lily went back to her cereal with the satisfaction of a child whose assessment of the situation had been confirmed. Carla called Claire and then Belham and then Patricia, in that order, and by mid-morning the 4 of them were on a call together in the way they had been on calls together dozens of times across the past year. The small circle of people who had been present for most of this and who understood, each from their own angle, what it meant. Claire walked them through the appendices methodically. The Holbein was appraised at $68 million, the highest single object estimate in the collection and one that she said, with characteristic understatement, would generate significant attention when it became public. The 3 Jan van Heysenflower paintings together were appraised at $22 million. The Peter de Hooch interiors at $14 million combined. The Roysdahl landscape at $8 million. The Roman and Greek antiquities, assessed as a collection, at $31 million. The medieval manuscript pages at $6 million. The remaining paintings and decorative objects at the balance. She said the Holbein would need to be the subject of a dedicated announcement, coordinated with the major scholarly bodies and the relevant museums, because a previously unknown Holbein was not the kind of discovery that could be managed quietly once the formal process began. Belham said, "How soon?" Claire said they had perhaps 3 weeks before the information became public through channels they could not control. She said the appraisal report would circulate among the institutions involved in the authentication, and in a world where nothing circulated without leaking, 3 weeks was optimistic. She recommended a press conference, properly managed, within 10 days. Carla said, "In Harwick County." Claire said, "Wherever you want." Carla said, "Here." "At the property." There was a brief pause on the call. Patricia said, "Of course here. Where else?" If you're enjoying this story so far, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe. Drop a comment telling me where in the world you're watching from. I love hearing from you. The press conference was held on the second Friday of November, on the front steps of the main building, with the copper tower in the frame of every photograph, and the repaired tile floor of the receiving hall visible through the open front door behind Carla when she spoke. She had written and rewritten what she wanted to say across 3 evenings at the Carriage house table. Lily asleep, the snow coming and going outside, the main building visible in the dark through the window with its new exterior lights that Robert Cates had rigged in October when the authentication work required extended hours. She had thrown away the formal versions, the versions that sounded like the press releases Claire's office had drafted and that were accurate and appropriate and read like no one had actually lived through any of it. She had written the real version last, on a single page in longhand, and she had read it to Lily the morning of the press conference, and Lily had said, "That's the one, with the authority of a child who had inherited something of her mother's capacity for cutting through to what mattered. About 40 journalists had come. Local press, regional press, and several national outlets that had picked up the story from the Philadelphia piece that had run in the spring. 2 European news organizations were present because the Holbein attribution had traveled through art world channels and landed on desks in Amsterdam and London, where it was treated as what it was, which was significant. Patricia stood to Carla's left. Belham stood to her right. Claire Adler had come up from New York and stood at the edge of the group with the expression of someone watching a process she had managed to arrive at its intended destination. Carla stood at the top of the steps in a coat Donna from the shelter had sent her when the story broke, a good coat, warm and dark, sent with a note that said only, "You always looked cold." She held her single page of notes, and she spoke. She said that 13 months ago she had been homeless, sleeping in a laundromat doorway with her daughter and $3 in her pocket. She said that a woman she had never met had left her a property in Harwick County, Pennsylvania, and that what was in it had turned out to be one of the most significant collections of displaced wartime art and antiquities found in the United States. She said that the collection had belonged, in whole or in part, to families whose property had been taken from them, and that the most important thing that had happened over the past year was not the appraisal value, but the 9 families who had their pieces back. She said she wanted to name them, because they deserved to be named, and she did, all 9 of them, their names and where they came from. And she saw a journalist in the front row stop writing and just listen. She said that a woman named Ida Voss had kept this secret for 33 years because she did not know what the right thing was, and that she had eventually decided the right thing was to give it to someone who had enough reason to figure it out. She said she hoped she had figured it out. She said she thought she had. She said that the property at 14 Hollow Creek Road, Harwick County, Pennsylvania, was going to become something. She said she was not ready to announce exactly what, because she was still planning it with people who knew more than she did about various parts of it, but that it would be something open, something that belonged to the public in ways that a private estate did not, something that honored both the history of the building and the history of what had been found in it. She said the building was extraordinary and had been waiting a long time for someone to say so. She said that she was 32 years old and had never owned anything that mattered until 13 months ago, and that what she had learned in those 13 months was that the things that mattered were not the things you owned. They were the things you chose to do with what you were given. She stopped there. She had more written, but she folded the page and put it in her pocket because the room had gone very quiet in the way rooms went quiet when something had landed, and adding more words would only dilute it. The questions came for 40 minutes. She answered most of them. Claire handled the ones about legal process and valuation. Belham handled the ones about probate and property status. Patricia handled the questions about the building's history with the fluency of someone who had been waiting 11 years to answer them properly. One journalist, toward the end, asked about Gerald Purcell. Carla said she understood he was subject to an ongoing federal investigation and that she had no comment on that matter. The journalist said, "He tried to take this from you." Carla said, "A lot of people tried to take a lot of things from a lot of people in this story. Most of them are gone now. The things are still here." She said it without heat. It was just true. After the press conference, when the journalists had gone and the small group remained on the steps in the November cold, Belham uncorked a bottle of champagne he had apparently been saving for this specific occasion and poured into mismatched glasses he had brought in a bag, and they stood on the front steps of the asylum in the snow that had started again, lightly, and drank it. Lily, who had been allowed to attend on the condition of not interrupting, held her glass of apple juice and said, "Can I give a speech too?" Belham said, "By all means." Lily said, "I think Grandma Ida was very smart and also very brave, and I'm sorry she never got to meet us, but I think she knew we would be okay." Nobody said anything for a moment. Patricia said, "I think she did know." Lily said, "Good," and drank her apple juice with the finality of someone who had made a complete point and was satisfied with it. The news moved fast once it was out. By the following morning, the story had run in the Associated Press wire and appeared on the websites of newspapers in a dozen states. By afternoon, it had reached European outlets, the Dutch and German press in particular, given the provenance of the collection and the nationality of the families involved. By evening, 3 television networks had called Claire's office requesting access for documentary features, and 2 publishers had contacted Belham asking whether Carla had considered writing a book. She had not considered writing a book. She was considering, at that specific moment, whether the East Wing stabilization could begin before the deepest part of winter or whether it needed to wait until March, because Robert Cates had flagged a section of the foundation that concerned him, and the answer to that question depended on ground temperature, which was not something she had known anything about 14 months ago, but which she now understood in the practical way of someone who had learned it through necessity. Belham handled the publishers. Claire handled the documentary requests with a set of conditions that most of the networks declined and one agreed to. A production company whose previous work Patricia had reviewed and approved as serious rather than sensational. The agreement gave the production access over 2 years for a documentary that would tell the story of the collection, the provenance research, and the foundation. It gave Carla final review of any material that involved the Eyre families. It required that the families' participation be voluntary and that their stories be told on their own terms. The producer, a woman named Alicia who arrived from New York in December with a small crew and the quiet observation skills of someone who had spent 20 years watching how things actually happen versus how people described them happening, spent her first 3 days on the property barely filming. She walked the building. She walked the land. She read Patricia's archive. She sat in the sub-basement vault for an hour with no camera running. On the 4th day, she told Carla that what she had found on this property was not the story she had expected and was better. Carla asked what story she had expected. Alicia said, the one where a poor woman gets lucky and becomes rich. She said that was the story the headlines had told, and it was not wrong exactly, but it missed the actual weight of what had happened. She said the real story was about something being kept alive across 3 generations of women who had no good options, each one doing what she could with what she had, until the right moment and the right person arrived at the same time. She said, your grandmother kept a secret that was too heavy to carry and too important to put down. For 33 years. I want people to understand what that cost. And I want them to understand what it means that you chose to do what you did with it. Carla thought about Ida Voss in a state care facility in Harwick County, 87 years old, dying with this knowledge. She thought about what 33 years of that weight felt like, the daily presence of it, the impossibility of sharing it, the slow diminishment of the person who carried it alone. She said to Alicia, I don't want her to be a cautionary tale. I want her to be understood as someone who was doing her best with an impossible situation, who eventually found a way through it. Alicia said, that's exactly how I want to tell it. They shook hands on it. The response from the Eyre families, when the press conference coverage reached them through various channels, was not uniform. Some were grateful and direct about it, like Daniel and Sophie Friedman, who had been part of the process from the beginning and whose relief was visible and uncomplicated. Some were more guarded, families for whom decades of navigating institutions and legal systems had made them careful about hope, who needed time and documentation before they could believe that what was being offered was what it appeared to be. One family, whose claim involved a single small painting of moderate value, had a lawyer contact Claire before they made any direct contact, which Claire said was entirely understandable and which she handled with the thoroughness it deserved. There was one family Carla thought about more than the others, though she would not have said so publicly. A family from Frankfurt, an elderly woman named Ruth and her daughter and 2 grandchildren, whose provenance claim had been the hardest to establish because the documentary record had gaps that the war had created and that no amount of archive research could entirely fill. Sokolov had spent 6 weeks on their case specifically, traveling to Nuremberg and to a private archive in Berlin, and had assembled a chain of documentation that Claire assessed as strong but not unassailable. Ruth was 81. She had been born in Frankfurt in 1943, after the worst of what had happened to her family had already happened. She carried the history secondhand, the way the generation born into aftermath carried things, in the specific gravity of stories told at kitchen tables, in the particular way her mother had described certain objects that were gone, certain rooms in certain houses that no longer existed in the form she described them. The object in question was a small bronze figure, ancient Greek, 6 inches tall, a runner in mid-stride. Ruth's mother had kept it on the mantelpiece of their Frankfurt apartment until 1938. She had described it to Ruth hundreds of times. The way the light caught the patina in the afternoon. The way the runner seemed, despite being still, to be genuinely moving. Carla had stood in front of that figure in the vault many times over the months of the research. She had looked at the runner frozen in his stride and thought about Ruth's mother describing it across a kitchen table to a child who had never seen it, trying to give her something that had been taken before she was born. When the claim was formally confirmed and the repatriation meeting was scheduled, Ruth traveled from Frankfurt with her daughter. She was a small woman with white hair and the careful, deliberate movements of someone whose body required attention but whose mind did not. She walked through the main building slowly, looking at everything, saying little. In the vault, when Carla placed the bronze runner on the table in front of her, Ruth stood very still for a long moment, and then she looked at Carla and said something in German. Her daughter translated. She says it looks exactly like her mother described it. Carla said, "I'm glad." Ruth reached out and touched the runner's shoulder, the flat, smooth surface of the bronze, and said something else. The daughter's voice was careful. She says her mother told her that the runner was always going somewhere, that he never arrived, but he was always going. She says she thinks that was her mother's way of hoping, that the things that were taken were always in motion, were always on their way back. Carla looked at the bronze figure on the table, the runner in his eternal stride, going somewhere he would never quite reach. She thought, they arrived. The weeks after the press conference moved differently from the months before it. The sustained pressure of the unknown was gone, replaced by a different kind of work, the work of building something rather than simply surviving long enough to get the chance to. Carla found she needed a few days to adjust to this. She had been operating in crisis mode for so long that the absence of immediate threat felt unfamiliar, like a sound you had been hearing for so long you only noticed it when it stopped. She spent those first days walking the property, not working it, not assessing it, just walking it. The 62 acres in November were different from the October property she had first seen. The forest bare and the creek audible from further away, the ground hard with the early cold, the grass flattened and brown in the fields that had once been tended and were now returning to wildness. She walked the boundary lines that the original survey had drawn, stood at the corners of the property, and looked in every direction. She stood at the creek's edge and listened to the water. It was cold enough that she could see her breath, and the water was moving fast over stones she would not be able to see again until spring took the cloudiness from the current. Somewhere behind her, 200 yards away, the building was there. 4 stories and a copper tower and a chandelier that caught the light and gave it back in small colors. 62 acres that had been waiting, in the particular patience of land, for someone to stay. She had stayed. She thought about her daughter writing her record on the carriage house wall with a marker. 104 steps, signed with her name, as if she had always known this was a place worth measuring. She thought about a cardboard box outside a laundromat. She thought about everything that had happened between then and now, and she understood, standing at the edge of the creek in the cold, that none of it had been luck. Not exactly. It had been a woman named Ida Voss making a decision. It had been Patricia Marsh spending 11 years documenting a property no one else thought worth documenting. It had been Belhem not charging for his time because he had known Ida Voss and felt he owed her something. It had been Claire Adler declining Gerald Purcell's inquiry and waiting to see what the legitimate owner would do. It had been Dennis advancing against a timber contract because sometimes people did the right thing simply because it was the right thing and for no other reason. It had been small acts of faith by people who had no guarantee their faith was warranted. She thought about what she owed that and how to pay it. The county, which had watched the past 14 months with the careful attention of a local government that was neither sure what to celebrate nor sure what to worry about, sent a formal letter of congratulation through the county commissioner's office. It was signed by 3 commissioners, including the one who had sat on a board adjacent to Purcell's development company for 6 years, a fact that Belhem noted without emphasis and filed away. The letter said the county was proud to have such an extraordinary historic site within its borders and looked forward to working with the foundation on matters of mutual benefit. Carla read it and showed it to Patricia, who read it and handed it back without comment. The hardware store on Main Street put a sign in the window. It said, in handwritten letters on a piece of poster board, "Congratulations, Carla. We knew you'd stay." Rita from Harwick County, who ran the pharmacy and had given Lily a cookie without charging for it on their first visit, organized a community dinner at the Volunteer Fire Hall in December, the kind of event that small towns organized when they needed to acknowledge something communally and did not have a formal mechanism for doing it. 60 people came. There was a potluck and a cake that said, in frosting, 14, Hollow Creek Road, which Lily declared the best cake she had ever seen and which she ate a disproportionate amount of without anyone objecting. Donna from the shelter called on the day the appraisal became public. Her voice was the same careful, neutral voice it had always been, the voice of someone who worked with people in difficult situations and had learned not to project onto outcomes. She said she was glad. She said it simply, without elaboration, and Carla understood that the simplicity was the point. Donna had handed her an envelope in a shelter hallway 14 months ago and had not known what was in it and had given it to her anyway, because that was the job and because sometimes the job was just handing someone the thing that had been waiting for them. Carla said, "Thank you for the envelope." Donna said, "I almost didn't give it to you. Protocol said to file it. I filed it, and then I took it out of the file." Carla said, "Why?" Donna was quiet for a moment. She said, "Because you looked like someone who needed something to go toward. Not away from. Toward." The planning process for the property's future had begun formally in October, when Carla had engaged an architect with experience in historic rehabilitation, a woman named Vera Santos from Philadelphia who had spent her career working on buildings that other architects had declined to touch. Vera had come to the property twice before the press conference, walking the building with the same loving attention that the authentication specialists had given the collection, seeing what was there rather than what was damaged. She and Carla had talked for hours about what the place could be. They had talked about the history of the building, its difficult history, the people who had lived and suffered and died in it over 80 years of institutional operation, and how any future use of the space had to hold that history honestly rather than erasing it in favor of something more comfortable. They had talked about the landscape, the 62 acres, the creek, the forest, the fields. They had talked about the community, about Harwick County, about what the people there needed and what a place like this might offer them. The plan that had emerged from those conversations was not simple. It was not one thing. It was several things that the property could sustain and that the history of the place seemed to ask for. On the ground floor of the main building, in the receiving hall and the adjacent administrative rooms, a small museum. Not a large institution. Not a place that competed with the Philadelphia Museum of Art, but a permanent exhibition space for the story of the collection, the provenance research, the repatriation, and for rotating exhibitions of works that the families who had received their pieces back were willing to loan, on their own terms, for limited periods. A place where the story of what had been lost and found and returned could be told properly, with the names of the families on the walls, their histories present and legible. On the upper floors, after careful structural rehabilitation, residency studios. For artists, for writers, for scholars. Small residencies of 3 months to 6 months, prioritizing people who needed the time and space and could not easily afford it elsewhere, prioritizing applications from families with connections to displaced cultural heritage, from countries and communities whose histories the collection touched. The rooms that had once held patients in conditions that the federal investigation of 1971 had called deeply troubling would hold people who were making things, people who needed quiet and time, people for whom the building's complicated past was not a deterrent but a context. The sub-basement vault, properly lit and climate-controlled, would become a research space, open by appointment to scholars, to provenance researchers, to heir families tracing their histories. The objects that remained after repatriation would be held in trust by a foundation, their eventual disposition decided by a board that would include heir family representatives alongside scholars and conservators. The land would stay as it was, mostly. The forest would be managed carefully, the timber harvest completed thoughtfully over 2 years, the character of the old growth preserved. The fields would be farmed, not by Carla alone, but in partnership with a local agricultural cooperative that Patricia had identified, people who knew how to work land in this part of Pennsylvania and who had been priced out of acreage by years of consolidation. The creek would stay the creek. Vera had looked at the plan across the conference table in October and said, "This is ambitious." Carla had said, "I know." Vera had said, "It's also right. It fits the building. It fits the land. It fits what happened here." She had said that last sentence with the particular feeling of an architect who spent her career arguing that buildings were not just containers but participants, that the history held in walls and floors and high-ceilinged rooms was real, and that ignoring it was not neutrality but erasure. She had said, "I want to work on this. Carla had said, I know you do. That's why I called you. The foundation was incorporated in December, with a board that included Belham and Patricia and Claire and Vera and 2 representatives from the Eyre families who had agreed to serve, Daniel Friedman from London and a woman named Marta from Rotterdam, whose grandmother had been one of the families they were still researching, and who had driven 4 hours from New York where she was visiting when she heard the press conference and called Carla directly. Marta was in her 40s and had a background in nonprofit administration and an intensity of purpose that Carla recognized because she saw it in herself, the intensity of someone who had been waiting for a place to put their energy that was actually worth putting it. She had come to Harwick County and walked the property and looked at the vault and looked at the building and said, "What do you need?" Carla had said, "Someone who knows how to run a foundation." Marta had said, "I know how to run a foundation." She had moved to Harwick County in January. If you're hooked on this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss an upload. Your support means everything and helps me bring you more emotional stories like this one. The first thing Carla bought with the money, once the appraisal was formally complete and the legal process of establishing her ownership of the uncontested objects was underway, was not for herself. It was a contribution to the elementary school in Harwick County to fund the arts program that had been cut 3 years ago due to budget shortfalls. She made it anonymously, which lasted about 4 days before Patricia mentioned it to someone and it became known, as things in small towns become known, without announcement or ceremony, simply by the mechanism of people telling each other true things. The principal of the school called her. She was a woman named Mrs. Cartwright who had the particular no-nonsense directness of educators who had spent 20 years watching their budgets shrink. She said thank you, briefly and sincerely, and then she asked if Carla would consider coming to talk to the students about what she had done. Carla said, "What specifically?" Mrs. Cartwright said, "About not giving up. About being homeless and getting a letter and deciding to try anyway. About finding something extraordinary inside something that everyone else had written off." She said she had 30 fifth graders who needed to hear that story from someone who had lived it, not from a textbook. Carla went in February. She sat on a stool in a classroom decorated with student artwork and looked at 30 10-year-olds who looked back at her with the alert attention of children who had been told something interesting was coming. She told them the story simply, without embellishment, because the story did not need embellishment. She told them about the cardboard box and the $3. She told them about the letter. She told them about seeing the building for the first time through the car window and Lily saying whoa, which made the class laugh in the way children laughed when they recognized something true. She told them about the vault, about 9 families getting pieces of their history back, about what it felt like to stand in front of a man from Rotterdam holding a plate his grandmother had described to him every Christmas. She told them that the hardest part had not been the $68,000 in tax debt or the legal challenge or Gerald Purcell calling her on the phone. The hardest part had been the moments, and there were many of them, when she had looked at the size of the problem and felt the pull toward the simpler choice, the choice that required less, the choice that was available and reasonable and that nobody could have blamed her for making. She said, "Every time I felt that pull, I thought about my daughter. I thought about what it would mean to her if I quit, not the practical consequences, but what it would mean about what was possible, what it would tell her about what she could expect from herself. And I couldn't give her that lesson. So I didn't quit." A girl in the front row raised her hand and said, "What's going to happen to the building?" Carla said, "It's going to become a place where people make things, where families come to find out what happened to things that belong to them, where the history of what happened there, all of it, including the parts that were hard, gets told honestly." The girl said, "Is it still scary inside?" Carla said, "It used to be, a little. Not anymore." The girl said, "What changed?" Carla thought about the chandelier, about the tile floor, about the receiving hall painted the warm cream of the original color, the way it looked now in the early morning when the winter light came through the arched windows and lay across the repaired tile in long rectangles. She said, "It became a place where someone was taking care of it." Scared places stop being scared when someone decides to stay. Lily, sitting in the back of the classroom because Mrs. Cartwright had arranged for her to be there as a surprise, said, "That's what she always says." The class turned to look at her. Lily lifted her chin with the poise of a child who had been the daughter of someone interesting for long enough to have developed equanimity about it. The spring brought the first phase of the building rehabilitation, Vera Santos on site 3 days a week with a crew of local contractors. She had vetted with the thoroughness of someone whose reputation depended on the quality of people she trusted with historic masonry. The east wing stabilization came first, the burned sections made structurally safe, the open cavities closed against the weather. Then the roof over the north wing, the most urgent of the remaining vulnerabilities, stripped down to the decking and rebuilt with new slate that matched the original within a margin Vera described as acceptable and Patricia described as remarkable. The receiving hall was complete by May. The museum exhibition space was under construction in the adjacent administrative rooms. The sub-basement vault had been properly lit and climate-controlled, its contents cataloged to a standard that the major institutions involved in the authentication had said was among the most thorough they had encountered. A conservator from Philadelphia, the same woman who had restored the receiving hall plaster, came for 6 weeks to begin the long process of assessing and treating the objects in preparation for their eventual disposition. Carla moved out of the Carriage house in April. She moved into the staff apartment on the second floor of the main building, 3 rooms that had been the head nurse's quarters in the asylum's operating years, with windows facing south over the fields and east toward the creek. The rooms were small, but the ceilings were high and the floors were wide plank oak that had been under linoleum since 1952 and had emerged, when Vera's crew pulled it up, in condition that made the floor refinisher stand in the doorway and say something in Portuguese that his assistant declined to translate, but whose tone was clear. Lily claimed the room with the east window. She arranged her things with the deliberate care of a child who had been in temporary places for most of her conscious life and who understood, at 8 years old, what it meant to arrange things in a room that was going to stay yours. She put her dinosaur collection on the windowsill in order of geological period. She put the marker drawing she had made of the building on her first visit, produced in the car on the way home, on the wall beside the door. She put a framed photograph of the chandelier, taken by Patricia the day they cleaned it, on the small table beside the bed. She wrote her name on the wall inside the wardrobe, in small letters in the corner, in the place where it would not be easily seen. The way people left their names in the places they had been. The way people said, quietly and permanently, I was here. This was mine. Carla found it 2 weeks later when she was looking for a lost shoe. She stood in the doorway of the wardrobe and looked at her daughter's name written in the corner in careful blue marker. And she put her hand over her mouth for a moment, and then she went and found Lily and said nothing about it, just held her a little longer than usual before bed. Some things did not need to be named. They just needed to be seen. The museum opened in September, 14 months after Carla had first stood in the receiving hall and looked at a chandelier full of dust. The opening was quiet by design, not the press event of the previous November, but something smaller and more personal, an evening for the families who had received their pieces back, for the community of Harwick County, for the people who had made it possible. The families came, all 9 represented, some in person and some by younger relatives who had taken on the inheritance of the story. Daniel and Sophie Friedman came from London. The Vanderberg brothers came from Rotterdam. A woman from Munich whose grandfather's bronze figures had been among the pieces identified and returned came with her 2 teenage children, who walked through the exhibition with the intensity of young people encountering something that was both history and personal at the same time. The exhibition ran along the administrative corridor, 17 display panels telling the story in sequence. The discovery of the letter, the first sight of the building, the tax deadline and the race to meet it, the authentication team and the vault and what was inside, the provenance research and the heir families, the decision to pursue repatriation as the first priority, the return of each piece, with the family's permission to tell their story, 9 stories told with the respect they deserved. At the end of the corridor, the final panel, not about the money, about what the foundation intended to do with the building and the land, about the residency program, about the research space, about the farms and the forest, about the place that a building full of difficult history was becoming. Marta had written the text for that last panel. It said, some places carry weight for a long time before someone decides to carry it with them instead of away from it. This is what happens when someone stays. Carla had read it in draft and said, that's good. Marta had said, I learned it from watching you. The families moved through the exhibition and gathered in the receiving hall afterward. under the chandelier that was clean now and hung from a chain that would not fail, catching the warm light of the evening's electric fixtures and distributing it in the small, precise way that Victorian cut glass was designed to do, not flooding the room, but decorating it, suggesting that the room was worth the attention. Daniel Friedman found Carla near the door. He had a glass of wine and the expression of a man who had been thinking about what he wanted to say for several months. He said, "My grandmother died believing the paintings were gone, believing that the things her family had loved and lost were simply lost. He said, I want you to know that returning them means something that I don't have the words for. I keep trying to find them and I can't." Carla said, "You don't have to find them." He said, "No, but I want to. Because what you did deserves to be said clearly." He paused. He said, "You could have kept everything. Legally, arguably, you could have. You had a claim. You had need. Nobody in your position would have been blamed." Carla said, "I know." He said, "So why?" She thought about this for a moment. She thought about Ida Voss, who had kept the secret for 33 years and died having never found the right moment. She thought about what it must have cost, that long custody of a wrong that she had not committed but had inherited, the daily weight of knowing and not knowing what to do. She said, "Because I know what it's like to have something taken from you, to be left with nothing when you should have had something. I know what it does to a person, over time, to carry that. And when I had the chance to give something back to people who had that carried that a lot longer than I ever carried anything, I wasn't going to be the next person in the line who chose not to." Daniel looked at her for a moment. He said, "Ida chose well." She said, "She didn't have a lot of information to go on." He said, "She had enough." Later, after most of the guests had gone and the catering was being cleared and the building was returning to its ordinary evening quiet, Carla walked through the exhibition one more time alone. She moved slowly through the panels, reading the words she already knew by memory, looking at the photographs she had been present for, the vault door open, the authentication team at work, Sophie Friedman's hand on the frame of her great-grandmother's portrait. She stood at the last panel for a long time. Some places carry weight for a long time before someone decides to carry it with them instead of away from it. This is what happens when someone stays. She thought about a shelter in the city and a letter in a hallway and a bus through the changing Pennsylvania landscape. She thought about Lily's face pressed to the bus window asking about the cows. She thought about Bellum's car coming down the Canopy Road for the first time, the building appearing through the trees. She thought about the moment she had stood in this hall and looked at the chandelier, gray with dust, hanging from a single chain. She had known then, in whatever way you knew things before you had the language for them, that she was not leaving. She had not articulated it. She had not made a decision in the way decisions were supposed to be made, with information and deliberation and a clear picture of outcomes. She had just known that the chandelier had not fallen, and that this was information, and that she was the person who had come here to understand what it meant. She turned off the lights in the exhibition corridor and walked back through the receiving hall. The chandelier was still lit, a single switch she had arranged to leave on overnight during the opening week. It caught the light and gave it back in its quiet way, small movements of color on the walls, brief and present. She went up the stairs to the apartment where Lily was asleep, her dinosaurs on the windowsill in geological order, the photograph of the chandelier on the table beside the bed. She stood in the doorway and listened to her daughter breathe in the old building that was theirs, that was home, that had been waiting an improbably long time for someone to open the door and mean it. She thought about what was still ahead. The North Wing still needed full rehabilitation. The residency program would open its first applications in the spring and would require everything she had learned about managing something that served people rather than just existing. The foundation's work was ongoing. The provenance research was never quite finished. There would be years of this, years of work that was difficult and specific and worth doing. There would be winters in a building that had not been fully heated since 1971, and springs when the creek flooded and the fields had to be assessed, and the ordinary accumulation of problems that came with caring for something large and complicated and old. She was 32 years old. She had a daughter who wrote her name in the corners of wardrobes and who had decided, at 8 years old, with the irreversible certainty of children who had found their place, that this was home. She had people who had chosen to be part of this, Belham and Patricia and Marta and Vera and Robert and Dennis and the families from London and Rotterdam and Munich and Tel Aviv and Frankfurt. People whose lives this had touched and changed, people she would know for the rest of her life. She had 62 acres and a creek and a forest and a building that the Victorian era had made out of materials that did not fail easily, that had stood through 130 years of weather and use and abandonment and neglect and was still here, still holding, still capable of being something. She had a grandmother she had never met who had looked at a granddaughter she had never met and decided, with the faith of someone who had no other options, that she was the right person. She was not sure she had been the right person. She was not sure anyone was the right person for something this large until they were already in the middle of it, and it was too late to be anyone else. What she knew was that she had stayed. She had stayed when leaving was available. She had chosen difficulty because the difficulty was worth it, because on the other side of it were people whose grandmother's portraits had been in a sealed room in Pennsylvania for 80 years, and because her daughter needed to see what staying looked like. She looked at Lily sleeping. She looked at the room, in their building, on their land. The first resident arrived in April, 2 weeks after the program opened its applications. Her name was Yael, a visual artist from Tel Aviv whose grandparents had been among the displaced families of the war, whose own work dealt with memory and absence and the particular texture of inherited grief. She had applied without knowing whether the residency would be ready in time for her scheduled sabbatical, and Marta had moved the opening date by 3 weeks to make it work because the fit was too right to lose to a calendar. She arrived with 2 large cases of materials and a smaller bag of clothes and stood in the doorway of the studio room on the 3rd floor, which had been one of the administrative offices and which Vera had converted with large north-facing windows that gave onto the forest, and she said nothing for a moment. Then she said, in English that was fluent and precise, "This is the right place." Carla showed her around the building, the same walk Belham had given her on that first October afternoon, the same sequence of rooms and floors and histories. Yael moved through it the way all the people who would come and stay here moved through it, with the attention of someone for whom this particular combination of history and space meant something that could not be entirely articulated. In the vault, she stood for a long time in front of the objects that remained, the ones without resolved claims, the ones that were now held in trust by the foundation. She looked at them the way an artist looked at things, not assessing value, but reading meaning, reading what they had carried and what they carried still. She said to Carla, "Do you know what I find remarkable about this place?" Carla said, "Tell me." She said, "It held things. For a very long time, in the dark, it held things that belonged to people. And now it holds something else. It holds the fact that someone came back for them." She turned off the hall light and went to bed in the old building that was hers, listening to the particular silence of a large stone structure in the dark, the slight movements of old materials settling into the cold, the sound of the creek faint and persistent in the distance, water that had been running for longer than anyone could count, moving through the dark toward morning. She slept well. Thank you so much for watching until the end. If you love this story, check out the other videos on your screen now. I think you'll really enjoy them. And don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already. See you in the next story.